Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something fascinating, the 1908 revolution in the Ottoman Empire.
Absolutely. And you, our learner, have given us a great set of sources to work with.
Yeah, a really good mix. We're going to try and pull out the key changes, look at how people have understood this period, and maybe touch on some of the, the debates around it.
Exactly. We've got Kansu on the revolution itself, Ahmad on the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, or Taylan on the broader context, the longest century.
Right, and Abu al-Hajj on the state, Daringil on symbols, Tilly on revolutions generally, Findlay on bureaucracy.
Yeah.
It's quite the lineup.
It is. It should give us a pretty rounded view.
So our mission basically is to figure out what really shifted in 1908, explore the different interpretations, and highlight some interesting bits without getting too bogged down. Sound good?
Sounds perfect. Where should we start? The immediate aftermath.
Yeah, let's do that. What were the initial reactions? Did things change quickly?
Oh, incredibly quickly. I mean, you had widespread celebrations in late July, early August 1908, people celebrating the new constitutional order.
Pretty much everywhere.
Across most provinces, yeah. Kansu does note it was maybe a bit less obvious in some Arab areas in Albania, but generally, huge enthusiasm. There are even reports from Harput, specific examples of celebrations.
So a real sense of excitement then.
Yeah.
And did this translate into actual, political changes straight away?
Absolutely. It wasn't just symbolic. There was real public pressure, and Abdülhamit's chief secretary, a key figure of the old regime, was dismissed. Exiled to Damascus, actually.
Wow, okay. So a clear signal.
A very clear signal, and then almost immediately a general amnesty. Political prisoners in Istanbul were freed.
And what about people who'd left the country?
They could return freely, too. The amnesty covered political refugees and exiles. The estimates are huge. Maybe 80,000 Armenians, 60,000 Muslims living abroad. Gives you an idea of the scale of opposition before '08.
Those numbers really are something. It shows how much pressure had built up. So the CUP, the group behind this, they weren't just trying to bring back the old 1876 Constitution, were they?
No, not exactly. Kansu makes it clear they wanted more. They aimed for, pretty urgent amendments to that Constitution, specifically targeting articles they felt weren't compatible with liberal democratic ideas.
Okay, so what were their main goals? What was on their program?
Their program really paints a picture of a modernizing state. Key things included Turkish as the official language for all government business.
Right.
Equal rights and responsibilities for all citizens. Didn't matter what race, ethnicity, or religion you were.
That sounds like a big deal for the Ottoman context.
It was massive. Also, equality before the law for all Ottomans. Equal right to work in public institutions based on merit, not connections or background.
Okay.
And another big one, universal conscription. For all men, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, though they did plan to reduce the service time.
Universal conscription.
Wow.
That cuts across the old millet system, doesn't it?
Precisely. These points, taken together, were aimed squarely at dismantling the old system of privileges. Privileges based on community or class or group affiliation.
So establishing legal equality across the board.
Exactly. It was a fundamental move away from an absolutist state towards a more liberal one. Kansu really frames this as a revolutionary step in itself.
So looking back, how do historians make sense of all this? What are the main ways of interpreting the significance of 1908?
Well, as you'd expect, there isn't just one view. Kansu mentions modernization theory,
Right.
which he notes came under a lot of fire in the 70s, especially from American academics. The idea was, that societies progress along similar Western lines.
But critics felt that was too simplistic, too Eurocentric.
Exactly, didn't account for power dynamics, history, that sort of thing. Then you have dependency theory.
Which focuses more on economics.
Yeah, it puts economic problems, Turkey's development, or maybe underdevelopment, right at the center of understanding its history.
And within dependency theory, there's a bit of a debate, isn't there, about when the real break happened.
That's right. Was it 1908 with the revolution, or was it 1923 with the republic? Dependency theorists often argue about this.
What's the argument against 1923 being the main break?
Well, as Kansu lays it out, some dependency theorists think choosing 1923 just based on economic policies might be a bit arbitrary. They'd argue the underlying economic structures, the dependencies, might not have changed as fundamentally then as sometimes assumed. It lacked theoretical grounding in their view.
Interesting. So the debate continues on that front. Okay, let's shift back to the immediate aftermath. What about the first elections under this new system?
Right, the elections. Kansu describes them as pretty lively. Especially in central Anatolia and the Arab provinces, competition often lined up along religious and political loyalties.
And did they manage to get a parliament together quickly?
Reasonably quickly, yeah. By November 10th, you had 69 deputies from 31 districts. Just 6 days later, November 16th, it was up to 96 deputies from 60 districts.
Do we know anything about the results? Like, who was winning?
We get some glimpses. There's an example from an Istanbul election where apparently a Turkish candidate got just 9 votes, while another candidate, presumably non-Turkish in that context, got 38. So it wasn't just one group sweeping the board.
That really highlights the diversity of the empire still, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Who were these elected officials? What kind of backgrounds did they have?
A real mix. You had the Eshraf, the local notables, influential families. You had ulema, the religious scholars, and also heads of educational councils.
So not just CUP members.
Definitely not. Kansu makes the point the CUP didn't win everywhere. He mentions a Greek candidate winning in drama, for example. It shows that the political landscape was still quite fragmented, quite diverse.
Okay, so a diverse parliament starts to form. But things weren't exactly smooth sailing politically in those early months, were they?
Not at all. Ahmad's work really brings out the early challenges. There were rumors swirling around after some cabinet changes, maybe attempts at distraction, but apparently not very effective ones.
And the CUP was getting nervous about some figures.
Yeah, they were reportedly quite agitated by Kamil Pasha, a major political figure at the time. His actions seemed sudden, unpredictable.
Kamil Pasha. Right. The newspaper Tannen had strong words for him, didn't it?
It did. Ahmad notes Tannen basically called his moves a coup, a violation of the assembly's rights, undermining the whole constitutional idea.
So the assembly reacted.
Yes. They convened on February 13th, 1909, demanding Kamil Pasha explain himself, especially about changing the Minister of War.
And did he?
Not immediately. His first response was just in writing. He said the change was due to important foreign issues, and he couldn't give an immediate explanation, which, didn't exactly calm things down.
Sounds like a classic political standoff, a real test for the new system. How did things develop from there? Did the CUP manage to consolidate its position?
It seems so, at least initially. Ahmad points out that by January 13th, 1909, so even before that confrontation with Kamil Pasha came to a head, the CUP felt strong enough to publicly distance itself from members who'd voted against Kamil Pasha earlier, suggests they were trying to project unity and control.
But that initial unity, or perhaps the initial approach, didn't last.
No, it seems they had to rethink things. Ahmad mentions the CUP's proclamation to the nation around the second anniversary of the revolution. In it, they basically admitted their first attempts at uniting everyone under the constitutional umbrella hadn't worked out.
Why not? What went wrong, according to them?
They put it down to being maybe overzealous. They also acknowledged that different racial communities, their term, were resistant to this idea of Ottomanism, this single shared identity.
That's a pretty frank admission. It points to that core challenge of nationalism within the empire, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's that classic tension in multi-ethnic states trying to modernize. How do you build unity when you have these strong, sometimes competing identities?
So did they change tack? What was the new strategy?
According to Ahmad, yes. They signaled a shift. Less focus, perhaps, on forging the single identity and more on the empire's material development. Things like education, trying to unite people through shared practical interests, economic progress.
Interesting. A more pragmatic approach, maybe?
Perhaps. But the politics remain complex. In June 1912, the CUP actually decided to reverse some of the 1909 amendments, the ones that had reduced the Sultan's powers.
Really? Why would they do that?
It's complicated. It suggests maybe they felt they needed the Sultan's authority for stability, or perhaps it was part of other political maneuvering. The law passed the assembly on June 22nd. It shows how fluid the situation was, how their thinking about the Constitution was evolving.
It really does sound unstable. Any other signs of that instability around that time?
Yes, definitely. Mahmut Şevket Pasha resigned as Minister of War, creating a vacuum. Nazim Pasha was offered the job but refused because the conditions weren't acceptable to the CUP. Mahmut Muhtar Pasha also turned down the CUP's offer.
So difficulty filling key posts.
Right. Despite all this, though, Said Pasha managed to get a vote of confidence on July 15th. 194 votes for, only 4 against. So there was still some ability to govern, but the underlying tensions were clearly there.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. How does Ortayle help us connect this 1908 moment to the bigger historical picture, especially in Europe?
Ortayli offers some really valuable context. He places 1908 within that broader sweep of nationalist uprisings that were, ultimately pulling the Ottoman Empire apart.
And he contrasts that with Europe.
Yes, intriguingly. He points out that in Restoration Europe, after Napoleon, the big powers were generally suppressing nationalism. Think Austria dealing with the Hungarians or Russia with the Poles.
But they didn't apply the same logic to the Ottoman Empire.
That's the paradox Ortayli highlights. Powers like Austria and Russia, while clamping down on nationalism at home, often supported independence movements for Balkan peoples within the Ottoman Empire.
Why the double standard?
Great power politics, essentially. Weakening the Ottomans served their strategic interests. It's a classic example of, pragmatic foreign policy overriding ideology.
And European actions directly help these movements.
Ortayli argues yes. He points to things like the Battle of Navarino, the naval intervention, and Russian pressure leading to the Treaty of Edirne. These were crucial in helping Balkan nations gain independence.
And internally, within the Balkans, what fueled the nationalism there?
Ortayli mentions the rise of a new, prosperous class. These groups had growing trade and cultural links with Europe, which helped foster nationalist ideas among the Christian populations.
People often talk about Russia's influence, right? Through the Orthodox Church.
Yes, and Ortayli acknowledges that. Yeah. Russian diplomats and the church connection were factors. But he also stresses something maybe less often discussed, the commercial and cultural influence of Central Europe, especially Austria. That also played a significant role.
Shifting back to internal Ottoman developments, the Tanzimat reforms that came before 1908, how does Ortayli see their connection?
He argues the Tanzimat wasn't just the Ottomans trying to copy the West. It was more a response to their own internal crises, combined with the pressure from expanding industrial powers in Europe.
And he gives the Ottoman bureaucracy some credit.
He does. He suggests that despite challenges, the bureaucracy was actually quite capable and played a key role in managing crises, not just, puppets of foreign powers.
But the Tanzimat had limitations.
Yes. Ortayli notes there wasn't much systematic effort then to organize knowledge or research. History writing, for example, was still mostly chronicles until later in the 19th century. There wasn't the same kind of institutionalization of knowledge you saw elsewhere.
That's interesting. What about education more broadly and foreign influence there? Did missionary schools play a role?
They did become quite active, particularly American ones, especially in areas where the Ottoman state's own education and social services were less developed.
Were these schools mainly for non-Muslims?
Initially, yes, and they certainly had an impact there. Ortayli notes, though, that by the early 20th century, the Muslim Turkish population generally didn't attend these schools in large numbers. That started to change a bit more after 1908, during the second constitutional era.
Okay, so we see these complex layers: internal reform, external pressures, rising nationalism, evolving political structures. How does someone like Daringil, focusing on ideology and symbols, fit in?
While the specific excerpts might not focus directly on 1908, Daringil's work on the Hamidian period, the reign of Abdülhamid II, just before the revolution, is crucial background. It helps us understand the ideological world the CUP was reacting against.
So the symbols and ideology of Abdülhamid's rule.
Exactly. The CUP's push for a constitution, for popular sovereignty, for legal equality, all of that can be seen as a direct challenge to the very centralized autocratic ideology and the symbols of power that Daringil analyzes from the Hamidian era.
And Abu el-Hajj, with his focus on the concept of the modern state, how does that perspective help?
Abu el-Hajj really encourages us to be critical about just slapping the label modern state onto the Ottoman situation without thinking carefully. He warns against easy comparisons with Europe.
So understanding the Ottomans on their own terms.
Precisely. Understand their specific history, their unique development. His critique of modernization theory kind of echoes what Kansu mentioned earlier. He reminds us that 1908 wasn't just about importing a Western model. It was a deeply internal transformation, shaped by the empire's own long history and specific social structures.
That's a really important methodological point. Finally, Charles Tilly's work on European revolutions. How can his broader ideas help us understand 1908, even if he didn't write specifically about it in these excerpts?
Tilly gives us a comparative toolkit, really. His general framework for analyzing conflict, revolt, revolution in Europe, it helps us spot key dynamics.
Like what kind of dynamics?
Things like how revolutionary coalitions form, the importance of the state's ability to govern but also to repress opposition, how different social groups interact during these moments.
So we can apply those ideas to 1908.
I think so. Those widespread celebrations we talked about, the swift actions against the old guard through Tilly's lens, you could see that as evidence of a major power shift, the emergence of a broad coalition demanding change. His work helps us think structurally about how such a revolution could happen.
Okay, this has been a really rich discussion, drawing on so many different perspectives. If we were to try and boil it down, what are the main takeaways from this deep dive into 1908?
Well, I think first, the 1908 revolution clearly brought immediate significant changes. Politically, socially, there was genuine, widespread enthusiasm for the new constitutional path.
But it wasn't simple.
No, definitely not. The period right after was marked by real political instability. The ruling CUP itself had to evolve its ideas, adapt its strategies as it faced the immense challenge of governing this incredibly diverse empire.
And the underlying problems didn't just vanish.
Exactly. Issues like nationalism, the empire's place in a changing world, those continue to be major factors. And as we've seen, historians offer different lenses, modernization, dependency, state formation, to understand the long-term meaning of it all.
And why is understanding all this complexity relevant for you, our learner, today?
Because the dynamics we've talked about, political reform, modernization challenges in diverse societies, internal versus external pressures, nationalism, these are not just historical issues. They echo constantly in the world today. Understanding 1908 gives us valuable insights into processes that are still shaping nations and regions.
Absolutely. Okay, let's end with a final thought to chew on. Given that initial wave of optimism in 1908, and knowing the immense pressures that followed, both internal and external, how might things have gone differently?
That's the big question, isn't it?
If there had been somehow a more unified, sustained approach to that early constitutional period, could it have changed the Ottoman Empire's path in those crucial years leading up to World War I?
It's impossible to know, of course, but it's definitely something worth pondering. What might have been?
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. A lot to think about.